All right, guys, so this was the assignment that I asked you to complete yesterday while there was testing going on. And this one was the, let me make sure this is the right one. Yes, okay, this is the Latin square one, where it gives you, I don't know why it calls it array tester. It looks like the names are different. Anyway, if you look at what this is, it says returns an array. This is the first method that you're going to write, and it's going to actually return an array. And if you look at the method signature, you can see that, because this right here indicates that's a one-dimensional array of integers in that spot where it says what it's going to return. It's going to take in a two-dimensional array and a value C, and it says returns one column of the two-dimensional array in the same order that they do appear in that array. So going from top to bottom, if you're thinking of a traditional set of a table with rows and columns. So you're not going to change the original array, and C, it tells you the precondition is that C is a valid column in that array. All right, and then what you other things that you don't need to implement, but you will have to use, and it'll make more sense after we look at what it's asking us to do. Public static Boolean, it's going to return either true or false, has all values, and it's taking in two one-dimensional arrays, R1 and R2. And it says returns true if and only if every value in array 1 appears in array 2. So you can assume that they have the same length and you can't change their values. That's the precondition and the postcondition. That's not something that we have to write, but it is something that we're going to have to use, otherwise they wouldn't have given it to us. So has all values, takes in two one-dimensional arrays. If all the values in array 1 are also contained in array 2, it returns true, otherwise it returns false. All right. Implementation not shown, so another one that you're going to have to use but not write, contains duplicates. It takes a single one-dimensional array, returns a Boolean. It says return true if ARR contains any duplicates, otherwise it returns false. So all we're going to do is take in a one-dimensional array and test and see if there are any duplicate values in there. Again, this one we don't have to write, we do have to know how to use it, and we're going to call it. To be implemented in part B, is it a Latin square? So returns true if a square is a Latin square as described in part B, false otherwise. So it takes in a two-dimensional array of rows and columns, returns Boolean. If it is this Latin square thing, it returns true, otherwise it returns false. Precondition, it says it has an equal number of rows and columns, and the square has at least one row. Okay. So let's look at some examples. This is where we write the first one, I think. Write a static get column method which returns a one-dimensional array containing the elements of a single column in a two-dimensional array. So we're going to either return these values right here, or we're going to return these four values right here, or we're going to return these four values right here. So we want to process every row, but we want to make sure that, so the row value is going to change, but the column value is not going to. So here's where it says, if you call it this way, I'm going to create a one-dimensional array called result, and I'm going to call arrayTester.getColumn. This is the getColumn method. Pass in this two-dimensional array, and I want to return column 1. So I want to return these four values that are going to get stored in this result, and it shows you in that result array, and it shows you what the outcome would be. That would be your result array. Oh, I said 1. 1 is this one right here. Didn't start counting at 0, which of course I should have. All right, and then the second one is, so this is where you would write it. We're going to look at the canonical solution in just a second. Now, in order for it to be a Latin square, and this description is pretty long, but it's not as complicated as some of you made it out to be when you were implementing it. It says, write the static method is Latin, which returns true if a given two-dimensional square array is a Latin square, false otherwise. Here's what a Latin square is. The first row contains no duplicate values. So you don't need to test all the rows, you need to test just the first row. All the values in the first row of the square appear in each row, and all the values in the first row appear in each column. Not necessarily in order, but remember that we have these two methods that we get to use. We get to use the contains duplicates, so we don't have to write that method, we just have to call it, and has all values, where we pass into one-dimensional arrays to see if they contain the same values. So in the examples that we look at, it says these are Latin squares. The first row contains no duplicates. It contains the values 1, 2, and 3. The second row contains the values 1, 2, and 3. The third row contains values 1, 2, and 3. The first column contains 1, 2, and 3, 1, 2, and 3, 1, 2, and 3. So not Latin squares. So this one is also a Latin square. First row contains no duplicates. All the other rows contain the values 0, 20, 10, and 30, and so as do the columns. Now this one contains duplicates, so it's not Latin square. First row does not contain duplicates, but the third row does not contain the same values, not a Latin square. First row does not contain duplicates, but the first column does not contain neither does the second one for that matter, but does not contain the same values as the first row, so not a Latin square. And here's where you write it. Well, let's look at the canonical solution. And the canonical solution for the first one, if you want to look at how you scored, did you construct a new one-dimensional array that has the same size as the number of rows in the two-dimensional array? Can you correctly access all the elements of one column without going out of bounds? And can you assign the element from the two-dimensional array to a corresponding value in the new one-dimensional array? And that you're returning the correct array upon exiting. And then part B, it says calls contain all duplicates, calls has all values, applies as all values, calls get column. So notice 3 of these methods, well, the get columns, which you're writing in the first one. If you go back up to the instructions for part 2, it says you must use get column, has all values, and contains duplicates to receive credit. So it's telling you you have to call those methods. Well, let's look at the canonical solution for the first part. So it takes in that two-dimensional array and the column that it wants to pull out of that two-dimensional array to return as a one-dimensional array. So the first thing you want to do is you want to create that one-dimensional array. They called it result here, and it has the same number of elements as the number of rows, because when I do r2d.length, it gives me how many rows there are, and I'm going to pull out from each row, I'm going to pull out the element of one column. So this one-dimensional array has to have the same dimensions as the number of rows that are in the two-dimensional array. And then we just traverse through the two-dimensional array, but I'm just going to, the rows are going to, all we're going to do is change. The only one that's going to change, I'm not going to have to worry about what column, because it tells me what column I want to pull. So I'm just going to have to use a loop counter that counts through every single row. So r equals 0, r less than r2d.length, r plus plus. And I'm going to store in my one-dimensional array called result in position r the value held in r2d, the 2d array, at position r and in, so at this particular row that we're on in the loop, and at the column that was passed in. And then we need to make sure that we return that one-dimensional array. So really, really straightforward. On the second part, and there are multiple ways of implementing it. When I wrote mine was a little bit bulkier than this, but I did have this first part where all I said, well, what if it contains, if the first row contains duplicates, it's automatically false. It's not going to be true. So notice that this is how I pass in the first row, square of 0, because that that is an entire row. Remember that a two-dimensional array is an array of arrays. So if it contains duplicates, I don't need to do anything else. I need to go back because it's already false. If I didn't hit this return statement, then I'm going to move on. And I'm going to check every row to see if every row has the same values as this first row.
Good afternoon, Santa Fe High School. Our quarterly game